After the First Crusade and the Minor Crusade of 1101, there were three Crusader states established in the east: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. A fourth, the County of Tripoli, was established in 1109. Edessa was the most northerly of these Crusader states, and was also the weakest and least populated. As such, it was subject to frequent attacks from the surrounding Muslim states ruled primarily by the Turks. Eventually, the Turks were able to lay siege to Edessa, and it fell on December 24th, 1144. News of the fall of Edessa was brought back to Europe first by pilgrims early in 1145, and then by embassies from Antioch, Jerusalem, and Armenia. Pope Eugene III called for a Second Crusade in December of that same year. The primary armies would be led by the French and Germans, as well as contingents from England. In the spring of 1147, the Pope also authorized the expansion of the Crusade into the Iberian Peninsula in the context of the Reconquista. The Crusaders agreed to help King Alfonso of Portugal attack Lisbon. In return, the king allowed the Crusaders to pillage the city's goods and keep the ransom money for expected prisoners. The siege of Lisbon lasted from July to October in 1147, when, after 4 months, the Moorish rulers agreed to surrender, primarily due to hunger within the city. Most of the Crusaders then settled in the newly captured city, but some of them set sail and continued on to the Holy Land. For the advance on Edessa, the German contingent comprised about 20,000 knights, while the French contingent had about 700 knights. The French knights preferred to fight on horseback, while the German knights liked to fight on foot. The professional soldiers of the Muslim states, who were usually ethnic Turks, tended to be very well trained and equipped. The basis of the military system in the Islamic Middle East was a system of fiefs, which supported a certain number of troops in every district. The Muslim states also relied heavily on Arab militias, though they were less well trained than the Turkish professional troops. The German Crusaders, accompanied by a papal envoy, intended to meet the French in Constantinople. However, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I feared the German Crusaders would attack and cause general trouble. Skirmishes in fact broke out, and the leader of the Germans, Conrad III, thought it wise to move along and cross into Asia Minor as quickly as possible. In Asia Minor, Conrad decided not to wait for the French, which turned out to be a huge mistake. He had assumed the Byzantines had more of a power base in Asia Minor than they actually did. Instead, the Germans found themselves with inadequate supplies in an inhospitable countryside. Eventually, Conrad decided to split his army into two forces, with the monarch taking the best troops for himself. The Turks were able to defeat Conrad using their typical tactic of pretending to retreat and then returning to attack. Conrad was forced to retreat back to Constantinople, with his army harassed daily by the Turks. The other German task force ran out of food and were either killed or captured. Next, the Byzantine emperor was concerned about the anticipated French arrival, especially after his relations had soured with the Germans. In fact, Manuel I signed a truce with his enemy Sultan Masoud I. This gave the Byzantines the ability to defend their empire against the Crusaders. The Crusaders had gained a nasty reputation for theft and treachery since the First Crusade, and were widely despised by the government in Constantinople. Despite these concerns, the French actually got along with the Byzantines when they arrived at the capital city. So much so that the French King Louis was given a huge feast inside Constantinople. Despite the good relations, the Byzantine emperor refused to provide any troops to the Crusaders. The French then entered into Asia Minor and met up with the remnants of the German forces. The Turks were aware of the French advance and were indeed waiting to attack. But in a small battle outside Ephesus on December 24, 1147, the French proved victorious. A short time later, the French fended off another Turkish ambush. Despite these early victories, the French army suffered shocking defeats in January of 1148. The Turks destroyed a large part of the French army. Other crusaders died by sickness or hunger. Louis and his army eventually arrived at Antioch. But by this time, the French king had lost interest in the military aspects of the crusade and preferred to finish off his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Eventually, both Louis and Conrad arrived in Jerusalem with their remaining forces. The Crusaders' original target, of course, had been Edessa, but the campaign had long lost its focus, and now the Crusaders decided to attack Damascus, which was a much larger and well-defended city. The Crusaders laid siege to Damascus in July of 1148, but the attack was doomed to failure as the Muslims launched constant counterattacks. By the end of the month, the Crusaders, low on food and water, retreated back to Jerusalem. This effectively brought an end to the Second Crusade.